Chapter 20. Lucas recognized trouble when he saw how empty the halls were. At first he thought it was because they were preparing for a second strike against the slaves in the dome, but he discounted that theory when they began passing areas that could have been used as mobilizing points for augment forces without running into any augments. The possibilities poured through Lucas's mind. It was possible that he had overestimated the size of Kappa 16's forces. It was also possible that the positions from which other troops were mobilizing were further distant, and Kappa 16 was hoping to keep his supply lines short. Finally, it seemed most plausible that Kappa 16 was keeping a large reserve of soldiers for the purpose of defending himself. Lucas wondered what might have happened with Row 82. He had not heard the blood-chilling shriek with which he had become familiar since the hostage situation in the slave dome. He also wondered why Kappa 16 would have hired him in the first place. It would have been a minor loss if they had simply escaped with Stephanie, and he had no way of knowing that they intended to free everyone. The oddities of the situation were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Lucas second-guessed himself as they carefully advanced toward the center of the complex. Kirana, on the other hand, was ashamed to have second-guessed him. She kept thinking of the time when Theta 10 had captured her. He was an augment with an abnormally large brain. His mobility had been augmented by large metal insect-like legs. He had felt so much better about his augmented legs that he had amputated his natural legs. He was absolutely revolting, and he had a fascination with genetics, which meant he purchased and or captured women wherever he could to carry the monstrosities he manipulated. He had been glad to have captured Kirana. Theta 10 had performed a series of scans on her and was trying to make pleasant conversation, notwithstanding the fact that he intended to use her body for his scientific curiosity. It had been the first time she had really been captured, and she did not like it. If she had been armed, she might have shot herself to prevent experiencing the terror she felt in his lab prison. The sight of sickly pregnant women in the other cells that seemed barely aware of their surroundings seemed to be a preview for what to expect from life. She had regretted letting her opponent bait her. He had anticipated that she would chase after the child he had kidnapped. He had also anticipated that in chasing, she would be less careful about observing her surroundings and focus only on him. He had used poor disguises for his cage trap that, in hindsight, she should have recognized. She shuddered as she was loaded into a large van. She wished she would have listened to little Lucas, who had warned her about his attachment to females. The stench of urine and blood had been extra strong, and though the crust of bread that he had offered her appeared to be safe to eat, the sensations and conditions of the lab had completely robbed her of any appetite. He had scurried around his lab on his long mechanical legs, whispering something unintelligible to himself. After hours of anticipation, suddenly the wall of her prison cell was crumbled, and Jonathan had stood in the opening with his long white cloak and swords ready. She remembered that being the first time she really noticed how impressive he could look. He had motioned for her to follow him. He tossed one of his swords to her and pulled out a map as they rushed down the hallway. "You don't remember how to get out?" she had asked in an unimpressed voice. "Of course I remember how to get out," Jonathan had said. "I just don't remember how Lucas told me to get out." Kirana had rolled her eyes. "Why does he care?" asked Kirana. "He told Daniel he could stop these experiments," explained Jonathan, as he swung back and chose a different passage. The clicking of Theta 10's mechanical legs against the concrete floor made them quicken their pace. Kirana looked around to see the augment's grotesque pale smile as he scurried rapidly toward them. She knew their speed was not enough to escape, but kept running anyway. To her surprise, a loud explosion from the ceiling just behind them poured large chunks of concrete onto their pursuer. He activated his defenses, and a retractable metal blast shield quickly slid over his human section, preventing any damage. His protection also extended to his head, so it also prevented sight. Jonathan, following Lucas's instructions, switched directions and went down another hall. Kirana had been impressed by how well Lucas had anticipated Theta 10's movements. It was not long before the augment was scurrying down hallways searching for the two of them again. Since the choices in hallways were few, he eventually spotted them rushing down a corridor and barreled after them. Jonathan pulled Kirana's hand to pull her forward. At first she tried to resist, but the sound of another explosion and raining concrete distracted her. Jonathan pulled her down another passage. When the concrete had stopped falling, they heard the angry yell of Theta 10, and then his mechanical legs carrying him closer. A third explosion forced him to stop. Jonathan and Kirana turned a corner and rushed down a long hallway. Lucas stood in the hallway, urging them to hurry, as Theta 10 turned the corner and scurried toward them. "You're out of tricks, kids," chided Theta 10 as his legs clicked quicker. Jonathan and Kirana sprinted as Theta 10 began reaching toward them with his human hands. He did not notice Lucas beginning to run in his direction, but remained focused on Kirana. A fourth explosion sent concrete raining down. Because Jonathan and Kirana were underneath Theta 10, they were shielded. The augment's reflexes activated his blast shield, making the concrete that fell on him bounce off harmlessly. Even from within the protective shell, Jonathan and Kirana could hear him swearing that he would rip the male apart and the female would bear children for him. Kirana had shuddered with a mixture of fear and disgust as the shield began to retract. Instantly, the sound of Lucas's shotgun echoed. It seemed to be louder and more sudden than any of the explosions through the halls of Theta 10's compound. Blood dripped down from Theta 10's pale face. Kirana looked back to see Lucas stowing his shotgun. "It's good to have you back, Kirana," he had said softly. She had been amazed at how he had carefully led the augment to believe their only strategy was planted explosives to prepare a strike the moment he lowered his blast shield. It had been the perfect strategy for dealing with his speed, since at the time they had not rescued Lizard. As her focus returned to the present, she wondered how many moves ahead Lucas had planned. Sig and Victor carefully advanced position as Lucas directed. He had told them that they were being watched, so it was important they kept aware of potential traps. They advanced slowly. Several times Lucas pointed out turrets and had Sig and Victor disable their targeting mechanisms. The lack of guards was becoming more confusing to everyone. Lucas tried not to let his confusion show. It was fine if the others did not see the plan, but his job was to outthink their opponents. He was supposed to be several moves ahead of Kappa 16, but he did not feel like he was performing his task. The group made it into an agricultural dome, and the temperature and humidity were much higher. As they traveled through the rows of grain, they noticed the unconscious bodies of dozens of slaves that had been working. "They're still alive," said Daniel as he checked a few of them. "They were most likely stunned." "He does not want to spend resources maintaining control over slaves when he is under attack," said Lucas confidently. He was certain about this point. As long as they are okay, we need to keep moving. This will only end with the defeat of Kappa 16. Daniel nodded in agreement. "Do you need me to scout ahead?" asked Lizard, who was tired of moving at such a slow pace. Lucas shook his head. "I know what's coming, and we could use your speed if we run into some guards," replied Lucas. Lizard scratched his head, but he knew that Lucas was right. Lizard had a talent for evading and handling larger numbers of opponents. It was one of the skills that made him an ideal scout, but it also allowed his friends to maximize the use of their abilities. While he occupied several guards, Kirana could pick them off with impunity, and Sig could neutralize the larger, harder-to-bring-down opponents. Stephanie followed Jonathan closely. Her anxiety was building. The calm feeling she had experienced when she freed Daniel and Jennifer was being slowly replaced by worries that something was about to go horribly wrong. She had learned to trust her gut with these matters, and it had allowed her to accomplish things that no one else had done. She had kept prisoners alive with food for months sometimes, and had been able to craft tools to improve living conditions in the slave quarters. Her mother had cautioned her that she was always being watched by Kappa 16, but she had never been detained by guards. Of course, she was also smart enough to cover her tunnels and to be in the company of other slaves when guards were near. She knew what happened to girls that wandered off alone and found themselves surrounded by the augments. Stephanie recalled the excitement she had felt when she learned about divine keys. She had, even when she was very young, believed that these keys would help her. When Jennifer and Daniel said that they had them, she knew she had to help them. She was compelled. It felt like destiny. Of course, when she saw Jonathan Knight, she began to hope for a romantic destiny as well. Jennifer was beginning to get the nagging feeling that she was late for something. She strained her mind to think of all the things she wanted to do. After being unable to determine what she might have forgotten, she tried to put the feeling out of her mind, but it lingered. It was overpowering, like the odor of rotten bananas in a garbage can that was in need of removal. She tried to look at Victor, who was courageously helping Sig to remove turrets as they advanced. Not even thinking of him could remove the sick feeling that she was neglecting something vital. Jonathan felt content that Lucas was guiding them. He had also remembered how carefully Lucas had planted the explosives and drawn the map in Theta 10's lab. He had been so angry with himself when Theta 10 had rushed in. The blast shield had protected the augments from all their attacks, and he had only lowered it to scoop up Kirana. Not wanting to hurt her, he had felt paralyzed. Lucas, on the other hand, had been confident in his analysis of Theta 10's movements. He immediately recognized the weakness of blindness that came from his blast shield and produced a strategy that would force him to use his shield repeatedly. He would then set up an attack while the shield was up and execute it the instant the shield was withdrawn. It had worked out perfectly, and Jonathan had even gotten to hold Kirana's hand as he helped her escape. Eventually they passed through the inner ring and approached the center of the complex. There was an armored hatch that led to Kappa 16's chambers. Lucas looked at it carefully and pushed it open. He tried not to let the lack of security surprise him, but he had expected a great deal of resistance. They slowly walked inside to see the room was filled with gigantic displays that showed every area in the complex in great detail. As he looked at the monitors, he noted that the only people visible were unconscious slaves that had been zapped. For a moment, he wondered if Kappa 16 had fled. The sound of muffled screaming immediately changed his mind. They walked further into the room to see the displays expand to show a small camera focused on the slave chambers. It had obviously just been set up, as the sight of guard torsos dominated the massive displays. After a few moments of adjusting, Stephanie's mother came into focus. Row 82 had a knife to her throat. Stephanie covered her mouth with her hands in horror. Lucas lowered his head in disappointment. It was easy to see that the slaves that had been equipped with stunners had been disarmed and were now lying face down with their hands over their heads. The sound of muffled cries and sobs indicated that they were all alive. "You don't seem to like hostage situations, do you?" came a voice from behind them. It was an elderly man that had mechanical lights and cameras surgically embedded where his natural eyes once would have been. They raised their weapons toward him. "Kappa 16, said Lucas in a low voice. "Put all of your weapons on the floor, or we will begin executing hostages," said Kappa 16 calmly. "And those keys of yours too. Put the keys on the floor." "No," shouted Sig. "You release the hostages, or I will kill you." Kappa 16 laughed softly. "Find the youngest child, row 82, he said. Lizard smiled, thinking his moment had come. He leapt toward Kappa 16. "Lizard, no!" shouted Lucas. A bolt of electricity leapt down from a ball on the ceiling and zapped Lizard, throwing him unconscious to the ground. Daniel rushed to him and gave him some water. "Stop!" shouted Daniel angrily. "No one move. We aren't throwing our lives away casually." "You should listen to the doctor," said Kappa 16 with a smile. "You want to survive," said Sig as he stepped closer, pointing his pistol at Kappa 16. "And your lightning can't stop bullets." The sound of screaming forced them to turn around and look at the monitor. Row 82 had killed Stephanie's mother. Tears ran down Stephanie's cheeks. Kappa 16 grew solemn. "Put your weapons down," said Lucas. "We can't lose any more hostages." Sig shook his head in frustration, but finally did as Lucas said. The others also slowly placed their weapons and keys on the ground. "Row 82, said Kappa 16 in a reprimanding tone. "I said the youngest child. The one you killed was important for leverage." "She tried to attack," said Row 82 in a low voice. "Take heed that you mind the elements of our contract, Row 82, said Kappa 16. Row 82 nodded apologetically. Kappa 16 turned and picked up the several mirrored keys on the ground by their chains. "You know," he said, "I have often wondered what makes one person able to use one of these and another person unable. It's not genetics, you know." Lucas clenched his fists as he watched Kappa 16 hold his key close to his mechanical eyes. The hum of gears focusing lenses and powering scans made them all feel uncomfortable, except for Stephanie, who was still weeping at the loss of her mother. "Very curious technology," continued Kappa 16. "Many, many years ago, there was a group of people known as the Council of Nine." Victor found Kappa 16's history lesson insulting. Augments hated the divine keys because they were not assigned based on fitness. To many augments, the divine keys represented heresy because they were not compliant with the philosophy survival of the fittest. "They say that the Council of Nine had the powers of God himself," continued Kappa 16. "Omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence." Kappa 16 turned to the group. "Many of you are able to use these keys. I am eager to see how I can harness these powers for myself." "Blasphemy!" shouted Row 82 over the speakers. They turned in surprise. He was obviously unhappy to be complicit in helping someone that wanted to use divine keys. The other augments did not share his opinion, however, and struck him on the back of the head, then held him. "Row 82, said Kappa 16 angrily. "You are such a purist, but your dogma is no different from that of the council that hunted owners of plantations, such as mine, those many years ago. Fitness transcends everything." "Individual fitness," corrected Row 82 angrily. "Those that use tools of religion become tools of religion." Kappa 16 scowled. "Your contract has been breached, Row 82, said Kappa 16. "I find that your seditious language gives aid and comfort to the slaves in rebellion against me." Row 82 shrieked loudly, causing everyone to hold their ears in discomfort. Seizing the opportunity, Row 82 rushed out of the grip of his captors and fled toward his truck. "Let him go," ordered Kappa 16. "I can see him, and I will ensure that he leaves the plantation." The augment guards nodded as they surrounded the hostages on the ground again. "Fascinating," said Lucas. The others turned to him in surprise. He was quite calm. "What is it that you find so fascinating, Lucas Flynn?" asked Kappa 16. "This plantation is like a game board to you," said Lucas. Kappa 16 smiled. "I suppose it is," admitted Kappa 16. "I know where all the pieces are, and I manipulate their movements according to my designs." "And when a piece does something unexpected, like Row 82, you remove them," said Lucas. "True enough," said Kappa 16. "He has useful augmentations, but he was far too headstrong. He thought he could see things I could not see." "You never intended to kill that woman," said Lucas. "Well, never is a strong word," said Kappa 16, "but I was fond of that woman." Stephanie clenched her fists with fury, but Jonathan grabbed her hand and shook his head, trying to get her to remain calm. Tears continued to pour down her face. "Tell me, Lucas Flynn," said Kappa 16, "I know that you are desperately trying to come up with a new strategy. When will you concede that I am superior?" "Not today," said Lucas calmly. Kappa 16 laughed softly. "You'll be here every day for the rest of your life, so I can wait," said Kappa 16. Unlikely, said Lucas. Kappa 16 focused his mechanical eyes and scanners on Lucas, as if trying to determine whether he genuinely believed what he had said. Everyone watched Lucas in anticipation of what he might say or do. "Why do you think that?" asked Kappa 16 impatiently. "You see," explained Lucas, "Row 82 was the only one about whom I was worried." "That seems foolish," said Kappa 16. "Everyone else is predictable," explained Lucas. "There's something strange about Row 82 that I myself have not yet uncovered. But your guards and yourself, you are unremarkable." Kappa 16's mechanical eyes hummed and focused on Lucas. If the augment had natural eyes, they would have narrowed with irritation at Lucas's words. "And you removed him from the board," continued Lucas calmly. Lucas pointed to the monitor that showed Row 82 roaring away in his truck outside the storage dome through which they had entered. "You've been so focused on your ability to see the pieces on the board that you've missed the pieces themselves," said Lucas. "Your beloved slaves are surrounded and unarmed," said Kappa 16 angrily, "or stunned unconscious throughout the rest of my plantation. You have no other pieces. Don't waste time with a foolish bluff." "It is true that we have no more pieces," admitted Lucas as he reached into his pack and pulled out a radio. "But that doesn't mean I can't remove your pieces." Lucas pressed a button on the radio. The large monitor that had been set up to display the hostages being executed at Kappa 16's command suddenly lit up. Every single augment guard had been equipped with a stunner attachment. The radio had sent a signal to every single one of these attachments that caused them to light up and hum. In a moment, a carefully orchestrated series of shocks were sent into each augment that flexed their arm muscles perfectly so as to position the main stunner right over their hearts. "Lizard's arm," whispered Sig with realization as he recalled the exercises that he had been performing on Lizard's arm with Daniel answering questions about various muscles. "You may not have realized that the manufacturer of these devices installed wireless receivers so that the functionality of these stunners could be shut down if they were stolen," said Lucas. "What?" stammered Kappa 16. "It's true," said Lucas. "I found that the signal could use functions that would send electrical impulses to the muscles in the arms of the users." "Impossible," said Kappa 16. After another moment, each of the augment guards uncontrollably stunned themselves. As they began jerking and falling to the ground, the slaves that had been in terror began to stand up and watch in a mixture of horror and awe. Kappa 16's mouth hung open in shock as he watched his entire force fall to the ground in defeat. If he had natural eyes in his head, they would have been wide with disbelief. Aside from Lizard, the rest of the group stood up and looked at Kappa 16 angrily. You can't touch me," said Kappa 16, pointing to his electric weapon in the sky. Lucas laughed softly and walked over to the wall. After entering a few keystrokes in the computer, he began speaking. "You know, Kappa 16, he said, "I've always been curious why you use Greek letters in your names." "What?" asked Kappa 16. He was shaking with fear. "Greek letters?" said Lucas. "What's the point?" He continued typing on a keyboard. "Don't! Stop it!" screamed Kappa 16 in exasperation. "Fine," said Lucas. He hit a key on the keyboard and the large glowing ball near the ceiling in the dome began glowing brighter. "What have you done?" screamed Kappa 16. The ball exploded, throwing Kappa 16 to the ground. "Okay, weapons and keys, everyone," said Lucas. They rushed to the pile of weapons to rearm themselves. Jonathan and Jennifer began passing keys out. "Daniel," shouted Jennifer as she tossed his key to him. It glowed as he put it around his neck and turned to Lizard to begin healing him. "Lucas," shouted Jonathan as he tossed the key of origins to him. He smiled as he put it on his neck and then suddenly gasped. The others paused to see what had concerned him. He turned to look at Kappa 16. The Augment's face had been injured with the blast, and blood was leaking from the sides of his visual apparatus. "Where did you get that?" asked Lucas. Kappa-16 laughed a bit before choking and coughing on his blood. "I stole it from the mute's mother," said Kappa-16. "And then I became her father." Stephanie's face grew pale as everyone turned to look at her. She clenched her fists and rushed over to him, kicking him in the face. As Kappa-16 turned over, his tunic ripped, revealing a mirrored key on the end of a chain about his neck. Everyone gasped in surprise. "You had a divine key this entire time?" said Lucas. "That's why you wanted to figure out how to use them." Stephanie picked the key up, and it began glowing. Her dark eyes suddenly flashed with white light. Kappa-16 choked as he saw it. "And to think that my daughter has the power to use this when neither of her parents did," choked Kappa-16. He began coughing violently and then gagged and became still. Stephanie pulled the chain from him and put it around her neck. Slowly her eyes faded and the key returned to its normal luminosity. "Stephanie, are you all right?" asked Lucas. She nodded, but she was not all right. Her body trembled as she looked around. The mixture of emotions she had experienced in the past day had been so intense. She had discovered divine key bearers, staged a rebellion, watched her mother get murdered, found out that the slave master of the plantation that had tormented so many people was actually her father, and learned that she was also a divine key bearer. She fell to her knees and wept.